Would you believe if we tell you that Phil Knight, the guy behind the revolutionary shoe company, Nike, was clueless about his life and thought he had no purpose whatsoever? Unsure what to do with his life, Phil went to the University of Oregon, where he studied journalism and developed his interest in running. It was here that he met with a track coach, Bill Bowerman, a famous coach in America who trained Olympic athletes. After graduating with a journalism degree in 1959, Phil was still very confused about what to do with his life. Deep down, he'd wanted to become an athlete, but at 24 years old, he had to admit it, the dream was dead. Despite all his lessons and training at college, he just hadn't got to the level needed. Phil then enrolled in the Graduate School of Business at Stanford University, and it was here at Stanford that he finally found his calling. While working on an assignment to invent a new business, Phil had an idea that would change his life forever. On a piece of paper he wrote, "Can Japanese sports shoes do to German sports shoes what Japanese cameras did to German cameras?" You see, Phil had noticed how two Japanese camera companies, Nikon and Canon, had replaced German cameras on the market which used to be more dominant, and he wondered if the same thing could happen with running shoes. Now at the time, two German companies, Adidas and Puma, were the leading running shoe brands in America, and they had a very strong hold of the market. But Phil had heard the Japanese were experimenting with some new shoe designs, and he also knew that it would be cheaper to produce shoes in Japan as well. So Phil got extremely invested in this assignment for his business class, and genuinely started to believe there was a great business opportunity here to import Japanese shoes into the American market. But his idea met with disappointment. Nobody, not even his friends, liked it. After graduating from business school in 1962, Phil had stayed obsessed with his idea of bringing Japanese shoes to the American market, and so he figured he would visit Japan to see if he could make his crazy idea into a reality. In 1962, in the city of Kobe, Phil came across one particular running shoe that caught his eye. The brand was called Tiger, and the shoes were manufactured by a company known as Onitsuka. Not only did he like the design, the shoes ticked the two main criteria Phil needed. They were clearly high-quality shoes, and yet they were relatively cheap. Phil liked the shoe so much that he decided to meet the owner of the company. Despite Phil having zero expertise in the business, he introduced himself at the meeting as an American shoe distributor who was going to help market their shoes in America. It turns out that Onitsuka had been looking for a way to sell its shoes in America already, so they were actually very excited when Phil came to them with the same idea. Perhaps that's why they were willing to overlook the fact that Phil looked like he was fresh out of university, which he quite literally was. The Japanese managers were impressed. However, one of them asked Phil a very simple question. "What's the name of the company you're from?" The truth was, Phil didn't have a company name because he didn't actually have a company yet. He just had this crazy idea to import Japanese shoes to America. After a second pause, Phil replied, "Gentlemen, I represent Blue Ribbon Sports of Portland, Oregon." He just kind of blurted the name out of nowhere, since in truth, he'd never expected to get this far. He went on to explain the size of the American market and how Onitsuka's Tiger shoes were different to what they had in America, meaning there was a huge opportunity if Onitsuka and him teamed up. The Japanese company were so keen, they basically began pitching Phil and asked him if he would be their distribution partner in the US, to which Phil obviously agreed. And then he asked them to ship over some samples to his address in America. It seemed like Phil's crazy idea was about to become a reality. 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, the time kept passing, and no shoe samples arrived. He ended up working as an accountant, but he didn't really like it. And then suddenly one morning, 12 sample pairs of shoes from Japan arrived at his doorstep. They were finally here, and it was worth the wait. They were just like he'd hoped. Phil was so excited that he went to see his old running coach, Bill Bowerman, to show him the new shoes and see what he thought. Bowerman was highly respected in the world of running, and he'd always been obsessed with improving athletes' shoes. Surprisingly, Bowerman liked the sample shoes so much that he offered to be Phil's business partner. And Bowerman was basically the perfect partner to have. He'd spent his life on the track training athletes. was one of the most experienced track coaches with countless records, and he was obsessed with the construction of track shoes. So, Phil and Bowerman agreed to be co-founders of the new company Blue Ribbon Sports, with both of them investing $500 each into their new company. And all that money was used to order 300 pairs of shoes from Japan at a price of roughly $3.33 a pair. Phil also wrote a letter to Onitsuka asking if Blue Ribbon Sports could be the exclusive distributor of these tiger shoes in the western United States. They agreed, and shortly after, in April 1964, a shipment of 300 tiger shoes arrived from Japan. Phil now had a shoe supplier, a business partner, and hundreds of shoes to sell. There was just one problem. What Phil didn't have was anywhere to sell the shoes. Phil had 300 pairs of shoes to sell, so he began going to track meets and running clubs and started selling the shoes from the trunk of his car. Clearly, there was demand for these high-quality shoes at an affordable price, as by the end of their first year, Blue Ribbon Sports had sold $8,000 worth of shoes, and so Phil used the money he'd made to order 900 more pairs from Japan. Shortly after this, they recruited some sales reps, mostly ex-runners who shared the vision of what the company was trying to do, and who worked solely on commission. They'd get $2 for every pair of shoes they sold, and so they drove all over America to every high school and college track meet that they could. This success allowed Phil to get a business loan from the bank so they could move Blue Ribbon Sports out of Phil's parents' basement and into its first real office. Phil decided to hire the company's first full-time employee, Jeff Johnson, the man who would later go on to come up with the company's iconic name, Nike. But for now, they were still called Blue Ribbon Sports. A clever move they made was they designed the store to be a sanctuary for runners, a place that they could hang out and talk and browse shelves full of books related to running, which helped them attract a lot of attention. And whilst Phil and the new employee Johnson worked on the business side of the operations, Bowerman was handling the creative side of things. For example, Bowerman began to tinker with the shoe designs. Once a shipment arrived from Japan, he would take a few shoes and rip them apart to see how they were designed. Once he'd studied the shoe, he would make notes on how to improve them. These notes were then sent to the manufacturer in Japan, asking for changes to be made before the next shipment. You could say that Bowerman was basically now designing Onitsuka's shoes for them. Around this time, Bowerman also started coaching popular runners and future Olympians, helping to build their brand further and sell even more shoes. And not just that, but Bowerman almost single-handedly made jogging popular. So, business was booming, and everything seemed to be going great between Phil's company, Blue Ribbon Sports, and Onitsuka in Japan. Together, they had created a partnership that brought success to both parties. But what Phil didn't know was that Onitsuka was planning to stab them in the back. Phil had asked Onitsuka if Blue Ribbon Sports could be the exclusive distributor for Tiger shoes across all of America, not just the West like previously agreed. But they initially said no, because they didn't think Phil's company was big or established enough to handle that, and they wanted someone with offices on the East Coast. On the spot, Phil immediately said, "But we do have offices on the East Coast." In reality, they didn't. But Onitsuka believed Phil and was impressed that Blue Ribbon seemed like a much bigger company than they'd realized. So they struck a deal for Blue Ribbon to be the exclusive US partner for the Tiger brand shoes, and Phil ordered 20,000 more pairs. The executive from Onitsuka told him he'd ship them to Blue Ribbon's East Coast office, which of course they didn't really have. So after the meeting, to try and raise money for these new offices, Phil sent out flyers advertising the chance for people to invest in Blue Ribbon Sports, but nobody at all responded. The only money they did get was from the parents of one of Blue Ribbon's early employees, Bob Woodall. Phil didn't want to take their money, but the banks were refusing to loan him any more, and so he had no other real choice. On the plus side, Phil and Bowerman both loved the shoes created by Onitsuka. They respected the quality of the Japanese brand. And of course, it seemed win-win for both sides, because thanks to their company Blue Ribbon Sports, Onitsuka had now become a formidable brand in the United States. The shoes quickly became the most popular brand in America, and they were selling out faster than they could keep up with. So Phil repeatedly tried to have Onitsuka send the shoes faster to meet the demand, but the Japanese brand continued to send them at the same pace. It was only later that Phil found out that Onitsuka had been selling to their Japanese customers first as the priority and simply importing whatever was left over to the US. It was unfair, but there wasn't really much Phil could do. Phil had already been a little suspicious that Onitsuka were planning to make partnerships with other distributors, and it was becoming increasingly clear that something wasn't right. Soon, he found out that Onitsuka was secretly plotting to replace Blue Ribbon and find a new distributor. From their perspective, now that they'd gained a significant foothold in the United States thanks to Blue Ribbon's efforts, the Onitsuka executives decided that they needed to move on to more experienced distributors to expand and increase their revenue. Phil was outraged, but most of all, he was hurt. He confronted them about this and pointed out they still had a contract in place for at least another year. However, the Japanese brand then gave Phil an ultimatum. Either we buy 51% of Blue Ribbon Sports, or otherwise we make deals with other distribution partners. Phil Knight immediately rejected their offer to buy his company. He didn't want to sell and he couldn't believe this was happening. Phil and Bowerman realized that losing the Onitsuka Tiger brand wasn't necessarily the end of the world. In fact, maybe this was an opportunity. They could be so much more than just a distributor. Why couldn't Blue Ribbon just make their own shoes and sell them? Plus, that way, they wouldn't have to keep waiting for shipments to arrive, and they could make as many shoes as they wanted. So, the two co-founders gathered the whole team together and began working on creating their own original shoes instead of selling Onitsuka's Tiger shoes. But first, they needed a name. Jeff Johnson, their first employee, said an idea had suddenly come to him in a dream the previous night. Let's call it Nike. Phil agreed to go with the name Nike. Then they needed a shoe manufacturer who could produce their new high-quality shoes at an affordable price. Rather than committing to just one manufacturer, he established a network of manufacturers, which gave him full control over production. That wasn't quite the end of their dealings with Onitsuka though, as they actually sued Blue Ribbon Sports, claiming that starting this new Nike brand breached their contract, which stated Blue Ribbon would only sell Tiger shoes. Phil then countersued that Onitsuka had actively been trying to break its exclusivity deal with Blue Ribbon Sports. In the end, both parties eventually settled and went their separate ways. In 1971, the company Blue Ribbon Sports officially became Nike, and by this point, the company had crossed $1 million in sales per year. And from then onwards, Nike's expansion skyrocketed as they began to grow into the most famous sports brand we know and recognize today. At the 1972 Olympics, Nike featured heavily, giving them a lot of exposure on a global stage. Revenue rose rapidly to $14 million in 1976, and then doubled in just 1 year to $28 million in 1977. Around that time, Phil opened new factories around the world and continued to reinvest everything in more growth, and it was working. Nike was on a huge upswing, but then one morning, he got a letter that changed everything. It was a bill from the US Customs Service saying Nike owed them $25 million. What had happened was that Nike's American competitors, Keds, Converse, and a few small factories, were getting scared of Nike's popularity and growth. They saw Nike as a threat that could potentially shut them out of the market. So, they sent representatives to Washington and lobbied the customs office to effectively put a stop to Nike's growth by enforcing something called American Selling Price. ASP was an archaic rule from before the Great Depression that said that if there is a shoe manufactured by a company in the US, then anyone importing a similar shoe from abroad must pay an import duty of 20% of the competitor's selling price. The whole idea behind this law was to promote nationalism and essentially prevent companies from importing products that could be made in America. And Nike's competitors had lobbied the federal government to enforce this old rule. You see, because Nike wasn't manufacturing its shoes in America but in Japan, their competitors realized all they needed to do was make a copy of Nike's shoes and make them extremely expensive. By doing that, they had successfully created an American alternative, and even though Nike's shoes were the original thing, because Nike's products were being imported from another country, they got hit with ridiculously high import fees because of this American Selling Price rule. This basically meant Phil would have to pay an additional $6 on every pair they imported. To make matters much worse, the import duties were backdated 3 years on every pair of shoes Nike had imported, which ultimately had led to the $25 million bill they received. Phil knew there was no way Nike could pay that much money. It would bankrupt them. There was only one option, and that was to fight. Phil hired one of the best lawyers he could find, and for 3 brutal years, Phil went neck and neck with the customs office and the likes of Converse and Keds in court. Nike also produced a TV commercial telling their story and explaining what was happening to them to try and get customers fired up and on their side. And it worked. Nike's competitors and their accomplices in the government realized Nike were going to fight this with everything they had, and in the end, they reached a settlement of $9 million instead of $25 million. Phil still thought it was outrageous, but in those 3 years, the legal battle had been going on, Nike had grown tremendously, and their sales had reached a whopping $440 million. So they could now afford to settle and put the whole thing behind them. It had been another close scare, but the company had made it through stronger than ever, and now it was time for some very good news. In 1980, Nike became a public company, which effectively killed its cash flow problems completely and allowed them to ramp up their growth even more. And since Phil alone owned a 46% share of the company, he became a very wealthy man. But also, remember earlier on the parents of one of Nike's early employees invested their life savings into helping the company survive when they were low in cash? Well, they hadn't done that as an investment to make money at all. They'd done it to simply try and keep the company alive. But they'd been given shares in return, and so after Nike went public, Phil had one of his happiest moments of his career when he got to tell them that their initial $8,000 investment was now worth $1.6 million. That money was obviously completely life-changing for them, and they couldn't believe it. From there on, Nike became bigger and bigger. Phil signed deals with 2 Chinese factories, which made Nike the first American shoemaker to be allowed to do business in China. They also branched out into selling clothes, and this not only helped them make more money and attract more investors, but it also gave them an advantage when negotiating endorsement deals with athletes, as they could now offer them more than just shoes, and celebrity endorsements were actually one of Nike's biggest keys to success. They agreed deals with rookie athletes like Tiger Woods and LeBron James in the very early stages of their career, and of course when they went on to become massive stars, it massively boosted Nike's popularity. And at this point, you might be thinking that Nike is simply an incredible business success story. But here's the thing. Behind all that success was a very dark secret. A secret that involved violent intimidation, slavery, harassment, and child labor. It was 1991, and everyone working at Nike was having a normal day when American labor activist Jeffrey Bollinger published a report that nearly destroyed Nike's entire reputation. In his film, Behind the Swoosh, he claimed that Nike secretly used child labor and that the company exploited people living in underdeveloped countries. The video claimed that workers in these countries were forced to live in slums or near open sewers, where they shared toilets and bathwater with over 100 different families. These workers were then cramped in factories, which were often housed in damaged buildings that posed fire risks. During their work hours, they were denied access to drinking water or toilets. At the end of the day, after which they had gone through all this inhumane treatment, they were paid a meager sum of $1.25. Then in 2001, a BBC documentary uncovered use of child labor and poor working conditions in a Cambodian factory used by Nike. The documentary focused on 6 girls who all worked 7 days a week, often 16 hours a day. All of these claims led to a lot of backlash, with many students and activists around the world participating in protests against Nike. Some people called for a boycott of all their products, and several universities cut ties with the shoe brands completely. Sales dropped and Nike's stock fell by 15%, with the company being portrayed in the media as a company willing to exploit workers and deprive them of their basic wages needed to sustain themselves. Phil Knight had always been in a position where he and his company were the good guys, but this time, he was the bad guy. It was a different challenge, and he responded by promising that he would personally ensure conditions at Nike factories around the world improved. After that, Nike spent the next decade trying to fix its reputation. Of course, the truth is, the company was basically founded on the principle of finding cheaper labor abroad in order to be able to make good quality shoes that were cheaper than competitors. But to be fair, Nike definitely did make changes to significantly improve conditions for overseas workers. And many human rights activists have acknowledged their efforts to minimize these problems, but allegations never fully stopped. A 2005 report by the company found that workers in up to half of its factories were still forced to work 60-hour weeks, made less than minimum wage, or were denied use of bathrooms and drinking water. And even more recently, in December 2021, the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights filed a criminal complaint against Nike and other brands, alleging that they benefited from the use of forced labor in China. Now, to be fair and give the other sides to this, Phil would argue that those factories involved in these scandals weren't actually Nike's. They just rented them along with other tenants. So Nike wasn't directly controlling these factories, they just made deals with them. And whilst that's not an excuse, Phil is right that singling out Nike for using sweatshops misses the bigger picture, which is that countless multinational companies use overseas labor with very questionable conditions in parts of their supply chains. Many of the items we all use every day were quite possibly produced with cheap labor in terrible working conditions. Thanks for watching. Until the next one.